Hi, everyone who's joining. We're going to get started in just a minute or two, but we'll give folks just a minute to hop on the call. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and get started just with our opening thoughts. So, good evening, afternoon, everyone from wherever you're joining us. Thank you for coming and welcome to the seventh event of the Engaged Communities series. So, the series is a joint initiative between the South Asian American Policy and Research Institute, or SOPRI, and the South Asian American Justice Collaborative, or SAJCO. My name is Indira Khera, and I will be moderating today's panel. I'm a writer and a journalist. I'm currently based in Wyoming, but previously I was a freelance journalist and a reporter at WBEZ in Chicago. I'm so thankful to be a small part of this series, which brings conversations on civil rights and civic engagement directly to our communities. The Engaged Community series is designed to create space for South Asians and allies to access knowledge, exchange ideas, and connect with resources that support justice and equity. So each month, we'll explore one of three core themes: know your rights, unpacking hate, and civic participation and democracy. And, we're doing this through conversations with expert speakers, advocates, and community leaders. Before we get started today, I'd like to share a little bit about each of our organizing partners. So SOPRI is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that was established in 2001. Through community-based research and strategic partnerships, SOPRI drives impactful policy change at local, regional, and national levels. It is dedicated to empowering South Asian Americans by advancing data equity and ensuring our communities are accurately represented in public policy. And SAJCO is a civil rights and legal services nonprofit committed to advancing the civil and human rights of the South Asian diaspora in the US through direct legal services, community engagement, and impact litigation. We'd also like to thank the Saba Foundation in Diaspora and Saba North America for their generous support of this series. Before we dive in, just a note that this session is being recorded and it will be available afterwards on SOPRI and SAJCO's platforms. Through the panel, please feel free to share questions. The best way to do that is through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Those questions will come to me and we'll all be able to see them. So that's the place to drop your questions, and we'll try to get to as many as we can during the discussion. So tonight's panel is Breaking the Silence: Domestic Violence and Immigrant Survivors. It is about the ways immigration and domestic violence collide and complicate each other, and we hope to use this space to break the silence through honest discussion and awareness. We're joined by two leading voices in breaking that silence, and I'm going to take wonderful panelists. So first, I would like to introduce Amrita Doshi, who is the co-founder and founding executive of South Asian SOAR. Like many, she came to this work as a survivor. Her journey began as an intern at Sakhi for South Asian survivors and later spanned public health, health tech, and community-centered design across the US and India. At SOAR, Amrita has built a national network of 50 organizations and over 200 survivors and allies, and has led groundbreaking initiatives including the first South Asian survivor storytelling anthology, original research publications, advocacy campaigns, and the first ever fund dedicated to South Asian anti-violence organizations. Outside of SOAR, Amrita is a cultural organizer and artist. She co-founded NYC Adavu Meetup, which is a collective for South Asian classical artists, and performs with several Bharatanatyam dance companies across the United States. Amrita, thank you so much for joining us. And now I'll introduce our next panelist, Aparna Bhattacharya, who started with Raksha Inc. in Atlanta, Georgia as a volunteer in 1995 and has been the executive director of Raksha Inc. since 1998. Much of Aparna's work is focused on gender-based violence in immigrant communities and providing training on the needs of underserved communities. She's been recognized as a 2013 White House Champion of Change and is proud of her advocacy work to ensure regulations under VAWA 2005 for H4 abused spouses. They were implemented and finally made available for South Asian survivors to access temporary work authorization for 2 years. She has the distinction of being the longest serving executive director of a South Asian organization addressing gender-based violence. Aparna is the founder and advisory board member of South Asian SOAR and board treasurer of API GBV. So thank you both for joining us. I'm so looking forward to our conversation. Before we get started, I just want to run through a quick outline of the panel so our attendees know what's coming. So we're going to have like 35 to 40 minutes of conversation. So I'll be asking questions of our panelists and they'll be responding and engaging with each other. And then in the last 15 minutes or so, I'll turn to the Q&A box and I'll try to get through as many of the questions that you all have posed through the panel as possible. And then we'll do some closing remarks. But that's sort of the plan for our hour. So I would love to start by just asking each of you to share what your organization does, what's the kind of work that you're involved in, and also how you came personally to focus on supporting survivors of domestic violence in immigrant communities. And whoever wants to jump in first can go ahead.
Amrita and I keep looking at each other. You. Guess I'll start. So Raksha works towards healing, empowerment, and justice for South Asian survivors of violence in Georgia. Our mission is to promote a stronger and healthier South Asian community through confidential support services, education, and advocacy. And how did I come to Raksha? My father handed me a flyer. I was working for a mainstream organization, a victim witness assistance program in the city of Atlanta, and Raksha was just starting, and my father handed me the flyer. And I'd like to think that I did it because of the chaos and violence I saw in my own childhood, but also probably generational stuff. Because the stories when I started doing this work that my father would bring up was about like his dad slamming doors. And then, even when I talked to my mom, just thinking about the control that her mother may have experienced. So I think there's generational reasons of why I came to this work. But if you had asked me in the very beginning, would I see myself working in my own community? I probably would have said no, because growing up, I was so frustrated with our community for not talking about the important things. And so I really, growing up in the US, in the South, didn't really want to engage in my own community a lot because I was frustrated with that silence and us not talking about important things. And so that's how I got into it. But Raksha was founded by two women who grew up in Augusta, had seen something very similar in their community, saw an auntie that was impacted by violence. And when they learned of organizations like Manavi and Sakhi, they had decided that they wanted to create something like that here in the South.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
And SOAR is actually, so South Asian SOAR, SOAR stands for Survivors, Organizations, and Allies Rising. And SOAR was actually founded not too long ago in 2020 by Aparna and a few other executive directors of Sakhi, Manavi, Daya, myself, who I wasn't an executive director of any organization at that time, and then one more person. And SOAR is actually a collective of organizations similar to Raksha that all around the US provide services to South Asian survivors of gender-based violence. So that there's kind of like a different model to our organizations, and SOAR is essentially like a collective, a network, a coalition of organizations so that we can do our work, stronger and better together. And then we sort of do a few more things on top of that. Given our name, survivors, organizations, and allies, we also try to build a network of survivors and allies who are usually young folks or people who've experienced violence who want to make an impact and shift the way that we talk about and address gender-based violence in the South Asian diaspora. And lastly, we kind of publish everything that we learn, collect, um, and yeah, just, all the insights from the South Asian community we publish into publications like the anthology, research reports, and briefings so that we can raise awareness, amplify our needs, and kind of break through the silence, even in our own field, that's around South Asian survivors. I'm seeing a question that says, what does
Yes.
SOAR stand for? Survivors, organizations, and allies rising. So the thesis or the thought being, it really takes all of us coming together to rise up against violence. And I came into the work like similar to Aparna. I mean, I think like hearing about stories of domestic violence, and then experiencing violence as a teen, that kind of got me really interested in or curious about what South Asian women are talking about this. And so I moved out to New York, and went to Barnard for college and immediately found Sakhi, which is kind of like one of the original, like OG New York City based organizations, and interned there. And then 10 years later, reached out and asked them what I could help with. And they were like, we've been meeting with Aparna and Rachna and Navneet, like all of these executive directors. It's COVID, and gender-based violence is increasing. Like we need to start working together. And they had been for many years, but they were like, we need to do this in a better and stronger way. And we decided in those conversations to actually start a dedicated organization that can support these grassroots orgs all across the US. So it's a little bit of like how I came in and also how SOAR was started.
Yeah, thank you. So a first question that I want to ask, can you describe for us what the prevalence of domestic violence is in the South Asian diaspora?
I can talk a little bit to that. And I typically tend to use the term gender-based violence. It's like, I think over the past few years, it's become a more comprehensive term that we've used. But domestic violence is like one form of violence within that. And so even our recent statistics that I usually pull upon kind of tell us the different forms of violence. So the one that I really like to highlight is a 2021 study of both South Asian men and women in the US that found that 48%, at least 48% experience physical violence. But in addition to that, 38% experience emotional abuse, 35% experience economic or financial abuse, if folks are familiar. And then a few that I wanted to share that I think are particularly unique to our diaspora are 26% of South Asians in the US experience immigration-related abuse, which is really relevant to our conversation today. And then around 20% experience in-law abuse, also kind of relevant and intersecting with our conversation today. And then just two more statistics, and then I'll pass it to Aparna to share more. I always like to highlight is there was one 2016 study that found that 25% of South Asian adults experience child sexual abuse. And I think sometimes when we talk about domestic violence, we think about like a marriage between two like middle-aged people, and we really like forget all the other forms of violence that kind of happen within the umbrella of gender-based violence. And I think child sexual abuse is under-addressed, and one that organizations like Raksha and many others have been like fighting to bring more resources to. And then lastly, a more recent study of South Asians ages 18 to 34 found that 85% of participants experienced some form of sexual assault. That's another kind of like term that I think sometimes is separated from domestic violence and we actually don't talk about enough. But I think it's so important that like young people ages 18 to 34, and that's just what the study, in this case, the participants in this study, but that's such a high prevalence of sexual assault. Um, and I think uh, we collectively feel like young people are not getting enough resources. And there's so much to do there. So that's just like a little bit of the landscape of what prevalence looks like.
And I think, the reality is, and this is why SOAR is so important because it's documenting so much of our work. There's not enough researchers getting data on our communities, and a lot of times we're not categorized correctly in the data. So I think while those numbers are alarming, I think they're probably a lot higher. So when we think about verbal abuse or emotional abuse, people sometimes can't identify it. They would not consider that abuse. And I think someone had asked, what's immigration abuse? And immigration abuse, very simply, is when someone is using immigration as a tool to keep you in a violent situation. So, for example, telling your partner, well, if you, um, don't behave, I won't file for your green card. Or actually, if they're on an, let's say they're on an H4 and, you know, things aren't going well, they may ask their employer not to continue that H4. They may also abandon folks back home, go home for a trip and you're on a dependent visa, and you can't come back. So, or now in current times, what people can easily do is maybe call ICE and report that this person is undocumented because maybe that person didn't file their paperwork, the person who's calling didn't file the paperwork, and report them and get them deported because they know that they might be leaving, know that they might be getting support. So this is another way in which we may control them through their immigration status by not filing the right paperwork, by not continuing it or reporting them to immigration officials or threats. I could think of one time someone was volunteering for an organization to get work experience because they couldn't work. And the abuser called and said, oh, they're working when they were just volunteering. So even taking away volunteer opportunities away by saying, oh, well, they're working and using that threat to control them.
Yeah, and thank you for clarifying that question about immigration violence, because that's not a term that I was familiar with either. I do want to get a sense of sort of what the broader movement of organizations who have been working in this field looks like. So what does it look like now? And I guess what has work in this field looked like historically?
I can start. And then Aparna should fill in because she's actually been there for more of the history, but I think I've collected some of it. Um, but this is a 4 decades old movement. As Aparna was saying, a lot of the organizations started off the way that Raksha did, which is like an incident happened in a community and people mobilized around it. And attention to that one incident then brought about like a groundswell of like more people calling in for help or, um, more breaking the silence around the issue of domestic violence. The other thing that I think, or I guess another way that these groups came about was a lot of just grassroots organizing of women, of South Asian women. And a topic that would come up and be shared among everyone is the experience of domestic violence. And so that ended up becoming such a cohesive kind of force for people across class, across like caste, religion to connect. And that ended up becoming like one of the, I guess, like key topic areas. And so today we have about 50 organizations all across the US, mostly California, Texas, and New York, New Jersey. I would say like where the biggest densities of South Asian populations are. Except with new immigration patterns, we're also seeing like more organizations in the Midwest or more like I would say like ethnicity specific or community specific organizations. For example, we're seeing like the Sikh Family Center or LAL, which works directly with Bangladeshi women in the Bronx. So like more specificity versus like all South Asian survivors. And typically these organizations are providing like wraparound services to survivors. So that's everything from like they call in requesting for help, they're given counseling, financial assistance, employment assistance, housing, health. Like I mean, Aparna will be able to speak to this, but it's basically like what are all of the things someone might need to move from a situation of crisis to one where they are stable and healthy, or also like what they want. If they want to stay in a relationship but to receive support, then that's something that they can choose to do. So something I like to say about these set of organizations as well is that I feel like they're kind of really adaptive community hubs. And like, for example, during COVID, they're the ones providing vaccine information or doing vaccine drives. Like they are adapting to whatever the community needs because often they're like the sole nonprofit, but a large part of what they do is gender-based violence work. Aparna, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that's kind of what they're like. And then I would say that's kind of, yeah, the key things, this 4 decade long movement of 50 organizations. And the last thing I wanted to say, just related to SOAR, is that they have actually been working together for many years through national conferences, like different advocacy campaigns, letters to the White House, etc. But this is the first time that they're kind of coming together in like a dedicated network. But yeah, Aparna, please add anything.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of when we first kind of came together was when Monavi would have the Arohan conferences, which brought a lot of us together in person to have critical conversations. And I think that ended somewhere 2007, 2008. But that was like a government funded grant that would bring us together to have those conversations. But you're right. We have many ways of doing this work, and it'll depend on the resources in the community and how the community grows to support. Like, New York, California has a number of organizations. So you can have the folks that are focused on domestic violence, but you also have the folks that might be interested, working on domestic worker rights, which also may have domestic violence, and you have organizing groups. But like someplace like Georgia, there's only one organization that is really doing this work. So we've had to kind of do a lot of things that, intersect with our work. And we started actually as an organization for South Asians in distress. That was our name. And domestic violence became the predominant issue of what we were dealing with. And then, of course, child sexual abuse and sexual assault became other topics. But, we run the gamut from being organizations that might just be doing community outreach and education to ones that are full service agencies that have their own shelter. So like, in Chicago and Maitri, like Chicago, Upnagar, Maitri in California, they have their own shelters and they're, much bigger organizations. And then you have some that are more grassroots, community based. And I think the description, we may do the work differently, but we also do that work differently because our regions are differently. The resources might be different. So we have to adapt to our realities based on where we are. Hopefully I answered that. Am I missing anything?
I thought
And
that
I
was
think
great.
I saw a question about like arranged child brides
Yeah.
and honor killings. And again, if someone is in front, like we may not do it back home, but what we're doing is the work locally. And if someone were to come here, right, then of course we would provide that support if we were worried about someone being a victim of honor killing, getting them sick. I remember once we had to work with a mainstream shelter, and the person there were, I remember them telling me, I'm sorry. Well, we don't do work on honor killing, and they didn't consider that intimate partner violence. Or even we had a woman who was killed by her father because she wanted to get a divorce, and getting them on the domestic violence fatality list was kind of like I had to push them to kind of be like, excuse me, this is still power and control. And even though the father chose to take his daughter's life, she was an adult daughter who wanted a divorce, that it was still considered a domestic violence fatality in my view.
Oh,
So it's sometimes I feel like mainstream may really have a very constricted definition, whereas we have a more expansive definition because we see how the family is involved and how it may play out. So if we are, like, if we can, we get the opportunity to try and address some of the issues if we're privy to it in enough time, right? We've definitely had
yes.
situations where we get calls from schools where they're worried about students being taken back, you know what I mean, once they graduate, potential forced marriages and stuff like that. So we do try to do what we can when it comes to us, but there's a lot of secrecy around some of this.
Yeah. I was saying I can't believe that it was so hard to get that listed as, domestic violence. And I mean, what you all are talking about is sort of bringing me right into my next question, which is, um, would you take a little time and talk about like what some of the unique challenges that immigrant survivors of gender-based violence are facing, as compared to survivors who might be US citizens? Like what are some of the unique challenges that come from that intersection?
Well, it's access to safety nets, right? Depending on when you came here, if you're not a US citizen, let's say you came in recently, do you have access to benefits if you want to leave an abusive situation? I think one of the things that, people are fighting about is, oh, the folks that are here that are undocumented that have access to benefits. And in a lot of the places you don't have access to a lot of benefits if you are not a citizen or a green card holder. And even if you're a green card holder, the immigration lawyers can talk about that, but you have to have 40 working credit hours, which is close to 10 years of work credit, either from you or your spouse, to be able to be eligible for those benefits. Now, in some of the states like New York or California, you might have more access to benefits, but generally in places like Georgia and the South, there is no additional benefits for survivors. So if you don't have an income, you don't have a work history, how do you leave an abusive situation and you don't have a credit history? And some abusers will mess up their spouse's credit, so they can't actually get housing, and it gets really difficult. So that's one aspect of it is, if you don't have the status, you don't have access to benefits. So a lot of immigrants don't have access to Section 8 housing, or they have to wait forever to get into it, and they have to be in a certain status. Really depends on what state you're in, and that's different state by state. Um, there's language access. If you don't speak the language, right? We've had numerous experiences where someone calls a shelter, and even though they're supposed to provide language access, they will send them, they're a shelter. We're not a shelter. They'll send them to us, or they'll ask us to do the interpretation when they're legally obligated to do the translation and interpretation. And we also recognize that people may not want to call us because maybe they're concerned of their community knowing what's happening because of the shame associated with it. And that makes it really difficult for folks to come forward and talk about it in their own community. And they worry about confidentiality. While we do keep things confidential, there's always that fear that somebody they may know will find out. Talked about immigration. That's a big one, depending on your immigration status. Yes, you can go to a shelter, but if you are on a dependent visa where you don't have permission to work, how are you supposed to support yourself? And that's where that H4 abused spouse relief is so important, because it might give someone 2 years, only 2 years, but it's something to at least secure some safety. Um, some folks who might be undocumented might try and apply for the U visa, but you can apply for a U visa. You have to have law enforcement or court support when you apply for that visa, and it can take 6 to 10 years for you to even get that relief. So what do you do while you're waiting for that relief to come? You can become victims of other crimes where housing folks, folks who you might be renting an apartment from might take advantage of you, community members might take advantage of you. People might think because you're divorced or because you are vulnerable that like they can take advantage of your situation. Like we have people who call, "Oh, well, you might have people that might want to work in our home, to help us do XYZ." Because they're wanting someone to basically be like a servant in their household, and because they're disadvantaged. And while there's nothing wrong with if someone chooses to do that, it's that expectation that just because someone's vulnerable, they might want to, be in that situation. So I think those are some of the challenges. There's immigration, like I said. Then there's the cultural and the community. The community often isolates so many survivors when they get a divorce because it doesn't meet that picture of the model, the model minority, or they're fearful that it will somehow impact them. And I think that isolation is really tough. And then what our faith and how our faith community also responds to it could be another barrier that many immigrant survivors might face.
Amrita, is there anything you want to add?
Aparna covered all of it.
The end of your question made me think of this. I would love to ask about what some of the like myths or misconceptions about gender-based violence that you encounter when you are working in communities and how that, complicates the work.
I can take it. Do you want me to go?
You could start and I can finish.
That's perfect. Yeah. I can speak maybe from more of like the advocacy angle because well, I would just say, first of all, like we're often sharing prevalence statistics, and people are like just shocked that that is the level of violence that exists. But then there kind of ends up being this light bulb moment where they're like, oh, wait, yeah, I do know this one person. And then I also knew this person and this person. And they're like, oh, actually, like if it's that common, in the stories that I've even heard of, I can understand how common it is more broadly. I think the other thing is like, again, people maybe not knowing like what is the full definition of gender-based violence. And like, I think with domestic violence, we also think about like only physical abuse. And I would say like one of the things we don't talk about at all is like, or we don't talk about enough is emotional and verbal abuse. And don't talk about at all is like things like sexual abuse and how that can take place in a relationship even. And I think so these are some of the misconceptions or just like even I feel like over the past few years with reproductive justice, having to really unpack the intersections um, and give more language for people to understand and recognize the patterns that they're even facing and that they could actually be in a violent or abusive relationship. So I would say like maybe with survivors, we've noticed a lot through our storytelling work, people will like realize that they were facing a certain type of abuse in retelling their story even decades later. So I think it's not a misconception per se, but I think like something that kind of is like unearthed. Um, and then I would just say in terms of like myths and taboos. I think one thing, just to like go back to young people facing relationship abuse, dating abuse, or sexual assault, I think there's a lot of pushing that under the rug, not believing it's happening, that kind of stuff, especially because we don't want to talk about like sex or consent or bodies for anyone that's like not in a marriage that we've deemed like okay, right? And so I think so much of that goes unspoken and unheard. Those are a few of the things that jump out to me. But I want to pass it to Aparna and see, yeah, hear from her.
Yeah, I think some of the common myths. Well, number one, to be very clear, that domestic violence and other types of sexual violence is about power and control. And I think it's often missed because people will think, oh, it's an anger issue. Oh, it's because they're drinking. Oh, it's because they have a bad temper. So we find all these excuses of what causes violence. And then honestly, it is about power and control, or they have a sex addiction. That's why they're sexually assaulting people, right? And it really is about power and control over another being. And when we see domestic violence fatalities, oftentimes it's because someone has taken a step to leave and it's the abuser's ability to kind of control the last step, right? You have finally, this is the way I am gaining my power and control back. As we talk about domestic violence fatalities, is this is I'm going to still have power and control over the situation. I think there's also the myth within our communities that it only happens in certain families. We tend to like think that certain classes of families are more abusive than others, but it happens in all of our families. And then we also use this narrative of which cultures and which faiths might be more violent than others, when in reality it impacts all of our cultures, all of our faiths, regardless of whether you have a lot of money and are highly educated or you have little education. So I think to know that we know that it can happen to any one of us, and that, it is a it is a pattern of behaviors, right, that are used to control an individual to make someone feel better. So, um, yeah, because I think I often hear, oh, well, if they just stop drinking, it'll end. It may not, right? It may not at all. And so I think it's important for us to know and look at the patterns of power and control and how they are controlling another being. Hopefully that answers the question.
Yes, yeah, thank you. And my next question I feel like is kind of so we talked about sort of misconceptions within our communities and now I'm curious about what the role you see maybe like a cultural stigma or the perception of South Asian communities playing in like maybe preventing survivors from seeking help or posing challenges in your work? Kind of like the external to the internal now is what I'm wondering about.
I remember once being at one event and it was like a lot of folks, it was a lot of white women at this community event, right, trying to do good. And they were just like, "But Indians are so peaceful and Gandhi and yoga." And I'm like, "Yeah, we still have violence happening in our communities, right?" So this assumption of who we are, or the opposite is it's part of our culture. So we're not intervening and we're not going to help because that is part of their culture, right? And to me, culture, there's family culture, right? And our family might have a different culture than what the larger culture is. And so there's many aspects of culture. And the one thing about culture is it's always changing, right? So there's a culture we hold on to and we may have based on our region, but the thing is culture changes. And even like if we look at movies in our communities from like the 70s and 80s to what movies are now, we're talking about a lot of these issues a lot more than we did in the past. Even how we talked about sexual assault, right? There would be a sexual assault in a movie and it was like the whole life is destroyed, right? And you've got parents, you know, threatening to harm themselves because of the shame associated. And now we have stories where folks are standing up and taking a stance around sexual assault and real life stories, right? Where people are coming through. And even though it might not be the most educated, it might be someone in a village like To Kill a Tiger, right? Where you have family members that are taking stands and saying something regardless and you may not expect that because we assume that everybody has to be educated, right? But you don't have to be educated to take a stand and show up for your communities and your family members who've been impacted.
I have like one tiny thing to add because I think Aparna covered it all. But the South Asian diaspora, specifically Indians, have a lot of wealth. And I think that's another kind of misconception of either we don't really need resources or support to support this work. And that's kind of both internal and external. I would say like South Asians don't often see this work as something that needs to be supported. It's seen as like charity or volunteer work, and that kind of relates to like just what does it mean to like provide services and that we have professionals that like do this work on a daily basis. But I think there's like a few misconceptions related to wealth and even um, the wealth disparities that exist in the South Asian diaspora that might like intersect with violence as well.
Yeah, thank you. Just for our participants, I wanted to let you know we're gonna talk for about 10 more minutes and then I'll start turning to some of those audience questions. So if you have any thoughts or anything that you wanna ask our panelists, maybe start submitting those now. Um, I want to ask about like law enforcement. I feel like many survivors are apprehensive about involving law enforcement. And so I wanted to get a sense from both of you, or what are some like alternatives or community-based approaches that you have seen work, or maybe alternatives or community-based approaches that you even practice in your own organizations?
I mean, I have heard stories of community members intervening and holding an abuser accountable or telling them to stop, probably bullying them. Um, we, like, again, survivors choose which way they want to go forward, right? And a lot of times, sometimes it is to call law enforcement. And in the past, depending on where we are, we've had some good relationships with law enforcement officers who've been great and have learned. And then you have ones who don't do such a great job. And right now, it's even scarier to call law enforcement because their connections to immigration. So I think that is a really tough thing. And sometimes we're just providing them with support in the healing and the economic empowerment. um, we, like in the South, don't have enough practice in other forms of intervention unless it's community intervening on their own. And we have to have, you know, part of what we also do is educate community on how they can be supportive to survivors and show up for survivors in many ways. And so we may like, sometimes the survivor doesn't want to call us on their own. And what we try to do is help their friend navigate how to provide support to them and show up for them. without taking over and giving it too much advice and overwhelming them. Because a lot of times there's too many people giving too many thoughts and ideas, and sometimes that can be confusing. But I'm sure Amrita can talk about some other groups that are doing different types of practices. I'm just not sure that we've done enough to really, you know, figure out the alternatives.
Yeah, I would say like it is kind of the conversation of this time period, which is how do we really acknowledge the like systemic discrimination and injustice that survivors experience when engaging with law enforcement or the court system, and how can we create alternatives outside of that? And I think honestly, I feel like there's both scholars that have been doing that work for a really long time, and it's also, I think, the beginning of really exploring what those alternatives could look like. One arena I've heard like that there's more work in is folks maybe 10 to 15 years out of a child sexual abuse experience, for example, holding a restorative circle with their parent or their abuser where folks are facilitating them through apology and repair after many years. So I think that's sometimes we don't think of that right away when we think about like crisis and like an acute, like servicing someone right when they're in a situation of danger. But this is an experience that sits with people like lifelong, and it impacts their mental health, their well-being, their family relationships. And then so there's so much potential for repair, and restoration, just like over one's lifetime. And yeah, one of the folks that we brought in, Sujata Baliga as a speaker for, one of our summits, who's a scholar and a survivor herself, does a lot of this work. So we can send like a link to her work or something in a follow-up. But I think that's a particularly beautiful and interesting example of just both how these types of experiences sit with us across our lifetime, and also the potential for alternatives to be valuable at like so many points in one's journey. And one thing I'd love to hear Aparna talk about, and this might come up a little bit later, is I think people often do turn to faith-based communities and leaders. Um, and sometimes I think that can be a great place, and sometimes I think it can also cause more harm. So I think it's interesting to also think about, like, as Aparna said, like, how do we actually need to educate our communities and equip them with the tools to be a source of support, not one that continues to perpetuate or normalize the violence, because I think there's equal danger there.
Yeah, I was gonna actually ask, when you're trying to sort of work with faith leaders, community members, and how to be allies in these situations, like what are some of the best practices that you encourage people to learn about?
I mean, part of it's just building relationships with those faith leaders, and some, even though they may show up at all the events, still may do this very wrong, right? But at the same time, you've got some that really show up and find ways to help people. I can think about some who have, helped someone help find housing and then provided the divorce when other folks wouldn't do it. And then you have the ones that become best friends with the abuser and act like they are really great. And they're not. And then so you have ones that really show up and do the right thing and help write the letters and provide support. And you have ones that, it's their donor and they are like definitely, um, hanging out and spending time with someone who is very involved in their faith-based institution. So they continue to perpetuate the abuse. So it can go either way.
I wanted to say one thing that I don't think is happening per se yet, but there are, or Aparna might know more, but part of the like move outside of law enforcement or alternatives too, it includes like a concept also called transformative justice, which um kind of talks about changing the conditions for harm and also working with like abusers or people who have perpetuated harm. And I just wanted to, like, I don't think there's enough work in our community yet around that, but I think that that's like a growing and important part of the work, um to also like end the cycle of violence. And so I just wanted to like highlight that I think that that's something that like I think in the next 10 to 15 years we'll see a lot more of.
And there were groups here in Atlanta. There was a group called Men Stopping Violence, and sadly they don't exist anymore. But part of what they would do is do these education groups, and you would bring in someone from your community to hold you accountable. And of course, some of those classes were court mandated, but they would do a whole thing where men could learn what domestic violence was, and they would bring in a partner. And I think we had a couple of people from our community go through that training, and it really shifted how they thought about the work. So the more that we can create spaces where we can talk about it, and then also model ways that we can communicate, but also how you can have someone who you trust and love hold you accountable is an important thing. But I really think love and trust is an important part of that process. Because I know for me, if someone's holding me accountable, I hear it so much better from someone who I feel like sees me fully, loves me, and cares for me than I would if someone is attacking me. And that's just how I respond to that type of accountability, to say like, I know you can be a better husband, and I know you can be a better father, and but it takes a lot of time, trust, and someone who is already an important part of that process to help people figure it out. I like to say, like, my dad grew up with violence, and what I feel like I learned from him is that I could see him change when he had more realization, or when he saw me doing this work and he saw family members experience it, that I could see shifts in him in changing. Now, I think that a lot of the things that scared me about him had to do with his fears, right? Like, I remember hurting myself and being too scared to tell him because he would yell and scream. And what I realized about him was that his fears were based on him losing his mom at 6 years of age, and not being poor and not being able to have the money to be able to take, for TB, right? His mom died of TB soon after childbirth. And I think that that would come out like when my mom, like, burnt her face with steam from the pressure cooker, and he just blew up and, got upset and yelled, and mom went running to her dad's place because she was so upset with how he reacted. That I think so much of my dad, and I can't talk about everybody else because there are different levels of abuse and different levels of way violence plays out. But what I can see now as an adult, having looked at my father, was it was his fear of losing the people he loves, that he would yell and scream and be a little dramatic and, be scary. That I can see that now as an adult, right? Now, that's not true for everybody. That's not true for every situation, but I think it helps me realize how he changed and what realizations came to him to make him be better. If that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I want to ask about um, change on sort of a broader scale. In your work, what are the changes that you hope to see, maybe in policy or funding or even like community attitudes that you think could make really significant differences for immigrant survivors?
I mean, I really would hate I would love for people to stop demonizing immigrant communities, and I would love for there to be safety for survivors to get help and not fear, because currently it is scarier, and even the protections that were there, that were safety nets, are not there right now in the current year, I'd say. Um, so I would love for there to be more ways for survivors to be able to support themselves, get housing, to be able to work so that they can take care of themselves and their families. And I want policies. I mean, ideally, I don't want us to continue to have DV programs because I like for that not to be an issue, right? Um, but it is an issue. And of course, making sure that we're not in a situation where we're concerned about our funding being stripped away because of who we serve. Like, we should have safety for all survivors, right? And it shouldn't be conditional on how you identify, whether you're an immigrant. Um, that's the part that just is breaking my heart, and I want more safety for our communities, and I want our community to really know that it's important to fund this work, Just as it's important, I mean, it is just so important that we fund this work. We fund a lot of stuff back home. We fund a lot of um, religious institutions, but creating safety for individuals in our lives and to be able to work with survivors and not blow it off um, so quickly is such an important thing, right? Because we just don't want to believe it happens in our community when in reality, a lot of this happens in our community.
Sorry, I kind of like you got me thinking about so much, but so sorry if I repeat anything you said. But um one thing that I was just thinking about is um like on the note of we don't want the domestic violence work to have to continue, like something that might sound cheesy but that I think that like is true is that we'll always need support to build healthy relationships, whether that's across like people in a romantic relationship or a parent and a child. Like there are so many ways in which violence manifests that we don't have yet the tools and education to actually have like healthy ways of being in relationship with one another. So on the more prevention side, I think like we were talking about community education around everything from relationships to parenting to sex, consent, boundaries, mental health. Like I think that whole spectrum of things. And I feel like this is not just coming from the gender-based violence space, but it's like about all of us working together. I also think shifting norms around marriage, around stability, like around so many things that I think just allow for a certain level of like individual safety and freedom that we don't yet fully like understand in our diaspora. And I think those are the same kind of norms that have people telling others to stay in an abusive relationship, to like keep trying to put up with it, to stay for the kids, like all of these ways that we just hold the burden and the expectation of all of it. And I think so. I think there's like a few intersecting norms there that we need to like shift away from. Um, I would say those are kind of like my two things that I would add just in terms of prevention, and how I could see us like really shifting the generational harm that we see, and generational norms that we see towards healthier ones.
Yeah, and I think I saw a question that talked about intergenerational stuff and breaking the
Yes.
cycles. And
Yes.
so I really wanted to address like the importance of us working with children. I think
Yeah.
oftentimes what we hear from survivors is they want to stay in the marriage because it helps the kids, right? And that's a myth because my children, I mean, I heard in my own family, they didn't want to get a divorce because it would impact that child's marriage, finding a good spouse or whatever it was. And the reality is the harm that we do when we don't provide healing for those children and the harm that we do when we don't break those cycles. I have friends who are like, I'm never going to get married because of what I saw my parents do, you know? So I think that I don't think people realize the harm they do when they continue to live in violent relationships. And what example they set for their kids. And so I think the more that we can also, and our program does work with kids who've witnessed violence or experienced violence, in addition, that creating space for them to have words, space for them to heal. We did a lot of art workshops with young kids and to hear them, even when they've experienced another form of violence, to be able to use those words of like, these are boundaries. This is what we learned. So that's important. And I think like I remember seeing a 4-year-old like kind of curl his fist up towards his mom. And so you know that generationally kids are watching and learning, and we really have to create spaces for them to heal and have programs that address that so that they can learn something different and have a different set of tools to be able to live violence-free lives.
Amrita, is there anything you want to add sort of on this question of breaking, generational cycles of violence?
Just from the SOAR lens, I think something we think about a lot is building the power of survivors. Like I feel like there are so many people that have experienced these situations, and even after that, like there's not a lot of space to tell one story and for it to be received and held and actually like make change. Like one thing is to have educational programs, but I think like stories are often the things that shift people's understanding, hearts, minds about how violence actually like occurs, how it impacts someone, and how someone might even heal from it. And so I think there's something in this puzzle piece of all of the ways that we might work towards a violence-free world or break cycles of violence where survivors feel really empowered to share their stories, to be a part of the change, to drive solutions towards ending violence. Like, I think there's just a lot more that we can do there to like break the silence in a way that helps us break cycles.
And I just one of our last questions here, but our panel is called Breaking the Silence. And after this conversation, I wanted to ask both of you, I guess, what does breaking the silence mean to you? And how do you sort of want our attendees to think about and embody that idea after this conversation?
I have one little nugget that I can share, and then I'm sure Aparna has a lot more genius on this, but something I think about connected to the survivor power and leadership is like breaking the silence can be really itty bitty. Like it can even start with writing something in your journal or saying something to one person or intervening in one conversation. Like it can feel this like this big thing, but there are so many ways to do it on a really micro level that have ripple effects and make a really big difference. So to me, I think it's like sharing your story with someone. I think it's asking if you're hearing about violence. I think it's lending a voice of support if someone comes forward to you. Like there are all of these ways in which you can play a role in breaking the silence. But to me, it's like experiencing violence is such an isolating experience. It's one that like makes you and the shame is so strong that it really fosters this silence around one's experience. And so breaking it is like really transformative, I think, to being able to like heal, being able to find community, to being able to like recover from that experience. Yeah, so those are some of the things I think about.
Yeah, breaking the silence is also breaking the shame. It's building community. It's building solidarity with other survivors so that, you all can, everyone can provide love and support to each other. Breaking the silence is also about community, really showing up and finding the tools. Um, and like someone talked about the faith, like even that this happens in our faith and how do we show up for survivors? All that's important. I saw someone talked about like someone escaping from a faith leader and how our community just really silences it and covers it up. And I can think about a situation here where we even had South Asians that were political leaders that were denying a young girl's sharing her story, which must have been so hard. So much of it's getting rid of the respectability politics, which is why we don't talk about sexual assault when it occurs, and breaking the isolation that many South Asian survivors may feel when they've been assaulted, and that they feel like they can't even have someone. I think a doctor told me how so many survivors they'll see folks from our own community and they're always alone, whereas you see folks from the other communities that will have somebody with them. And that's the shame that we put on sexual assault to where people can't even feel like they can talk about it and get the support that they need. And then it's all held inside, and that's heartbreaking for me.
Yeah, well, thank you both so much for this just incredibly powerful conversation. I know I deeply appreciated it, and I'm sure everyone here tonight did as well. If there are any questions, oh, I see there might be something that just got put in the Q&A, but if there's any more questions, please share them and we can turn to those for a couple minutes. Let's see. Okay, so someone is asking, I don't know if you see this question, but what role can peer support play in supporting survivors? And also they're asking about supporting people who may be members of the LGBTQ plus community and how we can support them.
I think peer support it can be very powerful as long as individuals are in a place of being able to not let their own trauma spill out and bring that burden in, right? So you want to make sure, but so I think peer support has been very powerful. I've seen it in many spaces where survivors are supporting survivors, and some of the barriers that we may have in our larger community are sometimes broken when survivors meet other survivors. But I also want to caution is make sure you're ready to be that support, because sometimes it can become, this is what I did and this is what I expect you to do, right? You have to do it the same way I did. And we have to be careful about that because everybody has their own path and may take their own way. And a lot of our organizations work with LGBTQ survivors. So, I mean, in Atlanta, it's Pride Month for us. For some reason, October is our second Pride. So I know that we were really lucky to have volunteers from Tracone, Atlanta become a part of our first set of volunteers. So it's always been really important for us to be inclusive of LGBTQ survivors. And we know it's hard to come forward, but that has been a huge part of our mission. But it's a huge part of a lot of organizations are changing their names to be more inclusive, to really support all survivors. So, um, and a lot of us have been doing that work to try and show up for community in many ways. And I think that's even something SOAR has integrated into so much of its work as well. Amrita, you want to talk about that?
I think you covered it, but if I'm happy to add too if we have time.
Yeah, I think we have a couple minutes if you want to go ahead.
Um, I think from our angle, one of the, for example, like this isn't direct peer support, but one of the things we've done with the young folks who we call survivors and allies that have worked with us is they work together on creating like a zine that was a guide on talking about consent and boundaries. So that is a way that we got young folks engaged. I'm specifically speaking to young folks, but I think a lot of the young folks who also come to SOAR tend to be from the LGBTQ community. They're often looking for like a way to talk about this that's not maybe in some of the more like heteronormative ways that violence is talked about. And so even when we talk about things like consent and boundaries, we're doing it in a way that's like inclusive of like so many different types of relationships. Um, and even talking about, yeah, and we've also partnered with AC Rainbow. Um, but I think even things like a process of creating the zine and then engaging with it allows people to build community and give each other peer support. Like, how did you talk to your parents about that? How did you come out to your parents? Like, even those kinds of things. So I would just say like that's not a direct form of peer support with like a survivor in crisis, but I think that kind of peer community is so vital to breaking the silence, to changing norms and preventing violence.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. Are the zines like are they distributed within, I guess, like your community or like to other youth?
Yeah, like right now they're online, but there's
That's
also like yeah. Um,
okay.
Similar to our anthology too. Like you can actually buy a physical copy or you can get it online and like there's a discussion guide that goes with it and like you can read the stories and then you can kind of like there's like a host your own book club like guide. So really just trying to get these materials out into community for people to then use and engage with them to spark
Yeah.
conversation.
Yeah. Well, and that sort of brings me to my closing question before we wrap up, which is just are there resources, ways to be involved, after this conversation? What can folks do to, yeah, become involved in the work that you do?
I would say if you want to check out the list of organizations on South Asian SOAR, the member organizations, and find one close to you, there's a way you can get involved by, volunteering, serving on boards, also like or getting involved with SOAR through partnering or yeah, finding ways to just learn more and figure out how you can be an ally or be a part of starting conversations in your own community. So partner with some of these orgs to start these conversations in your community. So that way you can really keep breaking the silence.
And I will say everyone should donate if they can, not to SOAR per se, but like the organizations on the ground right now are facing the brunt of federal funding cuts. And if community can step up, that would make such a big difference into what these organizations can continue to do and ensure that we don't just have a 40-year history that'll get left behind, but that we can continue to do and grow this work. So I think volunteering and donating, really just even like getting a community event going can bring so much awareness to this work, so much support, and just so much joy around it too. It doesn't have to be like a sad topic. It's actually one that's like full of community and connection, a lot of healing, a lot of joy. So I think like that's not a way to get involved, but just a note because I think sometimes
Yeah.
people are afraid, but there's actually so much joy in the work, and in connecting with like local communities, especially and local organizations.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you both so much for joining us for this conversation. This has been like so insightful and so powerful. And thank you to everyone who attended for joining us and taking the time to be here tonight. Um, Before we wrap up, I just have a few quick notes. So SOPRI is conducting a live survey to better understand the experiences of South Asian immigrants. Your voice is important, and so we'd really appreciate it if you could take a few minutes to complete the survey. That link is available on SOPRI's website, and it will be in the chat as well. We're also going to be compiling notes and key takeaways from the panel and then sharing that as like a resource document with attendees. So keep an eye out for that. And then I also just want to plug the next panel in this series. So on November 6th, at the same time, there's going to be a panel focused on hate. It's called The Psychology of Hate, Unpacking the Roots of Prejudice. Um, you can register using the event link Bright that will also be dropped in the chat, but please go to that event. It should be a great conversation. And again, thank you all for being here and being a part of our conversation this evening. And I really hope to see you all at the next session. And then we can stay on the link until everyone, let's see. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and end this call. Let me stop the recording.